gentlemen, to conclude the performance of this great show, Stromboli, the master showman, that's me, and by special permission of the management, that's me too, un questo la noche, is presented to you something you will absolutely refuse to believe. Introducing the only marionette who can sing and dance absolutely without the aid of strings. Heigh-ho, so, quando piccolo gagardia. The only and one Pinocchio.
What a build-up. Go ahead, Pinocchio. Make a fool of yourself. Then maybe you listen to your conscience.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Disney Reel to Reel, a deep, deep, deep delve into the Disney animated canon. I am Wyatt, the Master Showman, and by special permission of the management, that's me as well, by the way, just in case you were wondering, but I present to you today a scholar who can write and lecture about Disney's relationship to adaptation, the one and only Rebecca Rowe. Welcome to Disney Reel to Reel.
Why, thank you, Wyatt.
Yes. So before we kick things off, I like to ask my guests a personal Disney question.
Ask away.
For you, yes, and for you, I have two to kick things off.
Okay.
Firstly, what got you into Disney?
Oh, Lord. I don't remember a time pre-Disney. My family has been into very, very into Disney as long as I can remember. I don't have memories of this, but apparently Beauty and the Beast, the animated version, was such a favorite of mine that I watched it so many times that we had to buy a new VCR tape because like the old one just, it got tired and it gave up. So I know that was something that I loved as a kid. We went to the parks, or specifically to Walt Disney World when I was a kid as well. And I think the spectacle of it all and the musical nature of it, I love musicals. So I think that's what really got me interested as a kid. And then as a scholar, I'm a children's literature scholar, but I've always loved Disney. And I just love being able to study what I love to engage with in my like normal life too.
Mm-hmm. So would you call yourself a Disney adult?
Oh, 100%.
Okay.
I actually write on the phenomenon of the Disney adult, and I am very, very much one.
All right. No shade. There are points where I feel like I kind of want to like push away from that a little bit, but then I always come back to being like, but isn't this thing great? And we all love it and no judgment.
Exactly. Disney is definitely complicated, which I'm sure we'll be talking about today. But it does have some really lovely things that we can love. Absolutely.
And also, would you say that Beauty and the Beast was the first Disney film you saw as a kid?
Ooh, I have no idea. So Beauty and the Beast, or it may have been Aladdin. They both came out before I was born, so I'm not 100% sure which one was shown to me first, but one of those two.
Okay. I was more of like, I guess I was more of like the Walt Disney girly in my household, getting all of those like really vintage movies on VHS, and then some direct-to-video sequels, which shall not be named. But yeah, it's good to know. So, today we will be discussing sequence 4.2 of Walt Disney's Pinocchio. The sequence itself is directed by Wilfred Jackson. But I have to ask you, what were your prior associations with Pinocchio?
Prior to what?
Prior to coming on the podcast.
So, this is maybe a bad confession to make at the beginning of this episode, but I hated Pinocchio as a kid. It scared the living daylights out of me, especially the Pleasure Island sequence still scares me to this day a little bit. But I mean, Pinocchio is based on a very classic children's literature novel, The Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi. So there's that association for me that like it's an adaptation. It's early Disney. I kind of associate it with, other movies that are coming out around the same time, like Fantasia, and the animation breakthroughs, I guess, that are happening at that point in time. And I also had marionettes as a kid, I think because I was fascinated by Pinocchio, even though it scared me. So I also associate it with some very specific marionettes that I owned as a child.
Care to share a little bit more?
Sure. About the puppets?
Yes.
Oh, bless. I think I got them at a street fair at some point, or at multiple different street fairs. At some point, I just started like getting them. I never figured out how to use them. I just thought they were really cool. And so I would like hang them up in my room. So I just had like hanging bodies dangling across my room as like a very small child, which I have been told since then is apparently creepy. But I was just so fascinated with the way that marionetters are able to make puppets look so lifelike. And I think that's why we have something like Pinocchio with the puppet that comes to life, is because marionetters are so capable of doing fantastic things with them. I mean, it even makes me think of things like The Lion King on Broadway, which is a lot of beautiful puppetry. It's not marionettes, but it's fun to see how Disney has come back to its puppeting roots.
Yeah. I never thought about it that way. It's really nifty.
Well, thank you.
So for me, I also avoided Pinocchio for nearly a decade. As a kid, the first 50 minutes were totally fine for me. But then again, as soon as we got up to those Pleasure Island shenanigans, you would likely find me hiding behind couches and whatnot.
It's awful. It's awful.
It is awful, but considering my research for today's episode, I think I might have more fun talking about it.
Fair enough.
Which is strange. But now as an adult, I can say that it's one of those Disney movies that, like, people tend to say that a lot of the Walt era films, they're kind of dated, their values are like irrelevant to today's standards and whatnot. But I have tended to, through my research, to like expand upon several movies a little bit more and be like, okay, some have more applicable values or presentations and whatnot than others. And Pinocchio is one that I, like Peter Pan, I feel like calling it a relic more than like timeless.
So you want to call Pinocchio a relic?
Yeah. because of its really strict, almost puritanical attitude towards children, and the way that they are like essentially forced into being good by their parents and other authority figures.
And that comes a lot from Colati's novel.
Yeah.
I was reviewing the novel this morning, and it's just really intensely harsh against children in the way that 19th century children's literature often is. Pinocchio makes one bad decision and like ruin falls on him and everyone around him. So I feel like Disney made some interesting changes, obviously a lot of very interesting changes when they were adapting the movie, but we still get that kind of, as you say, puritanical view of childhood is still definitely running through that movie.
Yeah. And especially when you think about it as a 19th century Italian attitude versus a mid 20th century American attitude. And it's just, I don't know how to feel about Walt Disney. Thinking like some of this stuff is okay. Some of this stuff we could go without, but whatever's still in is still kind of harsh.
Right. The scholar Nicholas Salmon has this great book called Babes in Tomorrowland, where he talks about, basically his argument is that the Disney company has basically shaped American childhood since approximately the 1930s forward. And one of his main arguments is that even to today, but especially in the Walt years, the image of the child that the company had was based on Walt's own childhood, and how he understood his childhood and everything. I mean, we see this in things like Main Street USA at the parks. But we definitely see it in a lot of the early films and the way that he's thinking through kind of older images of childhood than were really popular in the 30s and 40s until Walt brought them um, back into the zeitgeist, which is a really interesting phenomenon.
Yeah. I think his nephew Roy referred to his generation as like Victorian prudish.
Oh my gosh, that feels right. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Like he said they were one of the things that they were really sensitive about talking about was like death and whatnot. It was just a thing that they didn't ever want to bring up. I think he described it as something like dirty.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah.
There's some irony to that considering how many dead parents there is in Disney.
Oh God, we're already going there.
So many.
But before we get into any more serious subject matter, let's check back in on the plot of where we are so far, because technically the last Pinocchio episode I recorded was about the Blue Fairy's first appearance. So we're jumping like way ahead by like 15 minutes, but it's totally fine. This is going to be loosey-goosey. So previously on Pinocchio, the little Marionette had been misled by two furry con artists, J. Worthington Foulfellow and his crony, Gideon. They intended to make a quick buck by selling him off to a Romani puppeteer named Stromboli. Of course, Pinocchio's conscience, Jiminy Cricket, tried to put him back on the straight and narrow path to school, but he was left behind in a jack-in-the-pulpit. Rather than let the boy's dad in on the kidnapping, the Cricket instead pursued Pinocchio through the town. So, during story development, there was to be a scene where the fox and cat physically sold Pinocchio to Stromboli in exchange for a hefty bag of gold. 300 gold coins, in fact. But, as we'll observe later in the film, Stromboli gave them only a morsel of his earnings. Because apparently we just have to up the greediness of adults in this world.
In every way possible.
In every way possible. And I actually have an excerpt from a children's storybook that was published in 1939, just to get us in the mood, to open the scene proper, and also just because stuff's cute, and I feel like bringing it up. So how it starts in the book is, here business had been very slow. The caravan was scheduled to move on soon, but with this new attraction, things might be different. So today Stromboli set the stage, which was simply one of his wagons with the side let down to form a narrow platform, with more than usual care. Everything was set for a gala performance. When night fell, a gay crowd collected in the square. A record audience was on hand for the debut of Pinocchio the Great. Unquote. So, we are introduced to Stromboli. He's emceeing his show, and he appears to be a rather flamboyant showman who hides his anxiety over Pinocchio's ineptitude as a performer rather well. And then Jiminy is seen hopping up to a lamppost where he forces himself a spot amongst moths. And then, after shaking that bowl full of jelly for everybody, Stromboli prepares to conduct his small orchestra. So, I guess to kick things off, thoughts on Stromboli?
I find it really interesting that he is like the character that they decided to throw pretty much every Italian stereotype at. In the way that he's drawn, in the way that he talks. He's the only one who slips in and out of Italian. There's so many stereotypes just heaped on this poor character. Sorry.
No. And I was just going to add, there's even a little bit of anti-Semitism in there.
Well, there is. And as you point out, he's supposed to be Romani, which, I mean, is a whole other set of stereotypes going on. So there's a lot of different things. And this is really common for Disney, especially in this early time period, but we even see it occasionally today where villains get a lot more stereotypes, racial stereotypes than the good guys, which is problematic in its own way. I mean, even the fact that his name is Stromboli in Kaladi's text, his name it is Fire Eater, or that's the English translation. Um, in Italian, it's Mangia Fuoco, I think. So it's a very big name change, and I'm not sure what book you were just reading from. I don't know if that was a Disney production or not, but
It was.
yeah, okay, yeah. So the fact that they named him after an Italian food is really interesting as well. So there's just a whole lot of interesting going on with him, with his character design, just starting from there.
Of which his animation is handled predominantly by Vladimir Teitla, and his voice is provided by Charles Judels, who voices another character in the film that I will not talk about because he scares the shit out of me. Yeah.
Enough.
But Jiminy is just off to the side being very judgmental and being like, I know this boy's going to fail.
He is. And I think, so this is a little bit later in the scene, but towards the end of the scene, he kind of hops away sadly and he says something along the lines of, what does an actor need a conscience for anyway? And I think that's such an interesting line to include here. To have an actor read that out loud is just funny to me. But especially in the context of like all of the kind of unscrupulous and unethical things that Walt did as he's running the studio. So this little dig at actors I thought was really interesting. But yeah, for the most part, Jiminy's just being super, super critical and judgmental in the scene. I think that goes back to what you were talking about earlier with how kind of puritanical this movie is, and its judgment in kids.
Yeah. In fact, I believe there was a point where Walt's son-in-law, Ron Miller, he was like, he either had a job as it was around the time that Disneyland was being built, but it was like he was hired, he was given the opportunity to star in a television show that wasn't affiliated with Disney, and he told Walt about the opportunity, and Walt didn't want him to do it, and he was basically like, acting's for suckers.
Such an interesting viewpoint for somebody who works with actors a lot.
Yes.
I mean, that also, I mean, it makes me rethink the scene with Stromboli and the way that he treats Pinocchio. He's very dismissive of his, quote unquote actor. Maybe that's some Walt coming through.
I don't know. We'll get into it, but at the time, I feel like he might have felt like he was digging at other Hollywood moguls, but in hindsight, I think there's a little of him in there too. But then initially, as Stromboli is getting everything up and running, there was to be a prelude song simply called No Strings, with lifeless puppets announcing Pinocchio's debut. But this proved to be redundant after that whole spiel, and it got cut. But then the curtains rise, and Pinocchio is heralded as a stringless marvel, before tripping down some stairs and landing with his nose stuck in a knothole.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I'm going to admit, this scene, I have to admit, I don't think I was particularly interested in it because of the distance between Pinocchio as a character that we're supposed to be endeared to for the full hour and 30 nearly, and him as an unreal character, I guess. Because I found more investment in the ideas that this sequence raised more than what was actually happening. But I will say that the most striking moment for me was when it's just that wall of noise of like the crowd laughing at him, Jiminy chastising him, and then Stromboli's blowing his top and he's nearly going to kill the guy. Like all that stuff is just going at this kid who doesn't even know what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Pinocchio's being punished, but at the same time, he doesn't understand what's going on. And I just think that, yeah, this is incredibly harsh for him.
It is, and I feel like we have so many different interesting things going on with kind of a view of childhood in the scene. So we have Pinocchio, as you say, this is a very harsh situation. He can't hear Jiminy, but he can sure as heck hear everybody laughing at him. He can hear Stromboli yelling at him. And he just is kind of naive. Like, he doesn't understand what's happening, it feels like, because he keeps just like, it's like he'll look confused for a second, but then he'll just laugh it off. And I think that is, that says a lot about how we think of children as naive, that we can put them in these harsh situations, and as long as we're having a good time, they won't figure it out. Like, kids know when they're miserable. They can put two and two together. So I think that's a really interesting image of childhood that we get there as he's going through this really difficult situation. But we also have kind of like the clumsy child. We often see like children as clumsy in media to make them more endearing. I mean, we see that in Disney today. Rapunzel and Anna from Frozen both are very clumsy characters, and that's supposed to be one of the things that make them seem young and yet endearing and sweet and all of these other things. So starting off with him just face planting, I think is a way to make us feel for him when they're not wanting to do a lot of the larger emotional work that you're talking about.
Yeah. So do you think that Pinocchio is the OG Adorkable?
Oh my gosh, he might be.
Because Snow White was pretty much perfect in every regard.
Right. Like, she falls, but when she falls, it's like a problem. It's not supposed to be cute or funny or anything. So
Yeah.
he may be Disney's OG Adorkable. Interesting.
I'm cracking this code day by day.
Making all the connections.
Yes. But I do have some input from his animator in this scene, Frank Thomas. He recalled, quote, "He didn't have anything professional in what he did because that would fight his character. He had to be innocent, but he had to have a few little things that he could do. Kind of like Stan Laurel, always had something that he could do that was kind of special and kind of magical. So I had him move in uncertain ways. He didn't know how to act, and even at the end of the thing, when everybody applauded for him, well, he thought he was fine, so he applauded right along too. He didn't know the difference," unquote.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's interesting to put Pinocchio in comparison to child stars of the time, like Shirley Temple, who is perfect in all ways, right? Like she can sing, she can dance, she can act, she can do all of these things. And then you have Pinocchio, who, God bless him, is just trying to like survive the number, much less be good. And I think it's interesting that the animator is attempting to do that to make him look innocent.
Yeah. Plus, I believe she wrote about this in her autobiography, but there was a story where she was hired on to MGM temporarily, and she was shown to producer Arthur Freed's office, and not long after he exposed himself to her, and she just kept breaking out and laughing because it was how awkward it was, and then she got like kicked out of his office. And a similar thing kind of happened with her mom going into Louis B. Mayer's office, and
oh my gosh.
And they vowed never to come back.
Well, I work on Disney, so I am more aware of the problems with Walt Disney, but it's like all of those giants from back then, and obviously it's still a problem today. Make awful choices and are occasionally awful human beings. So that's super fun.
Yeah. But I guess where I'm trying to come from is that we're here because of Walt Disney, obviously, but because of the whole culture, the counterculture, I guess, that views him as like this unholy imperialist who has come to like wreck popular culture, things like that. I just have to take a few steps back and take into account that this man is not Louis B. Mayer,
That is perfectly fair. They all had their own issues in their own ways. But I think you make a good point that Walt kind of gets it from all sides. Different people picking, like critiquing him for different reasons, and he should be critiqued for many reasons.
Yes.
But I guess he could have been worse.
He could have placed his hand repeatedly on Judy Garland's breast and have her write in her memoirs that were unpublished. She was like, I was almost grateful that I did not sing with another part of my anatomy.
Oh my gosh.
Anyway.
I know. Just on that fun note.
So recomposing himself, Pinocchio begins to sing I've Got No Strings, gaining more and more confidence before fumbling his way along the stage with each new set change. But before we get into that can of worms, do you think there's anything in the song itself that relates to the subject of childhood?
I mean, so like I said earlier, Disney childhood is American childhood, right? It's the idea that we have of childhood. One of the ways that, so one of the US's like driving values is the idea of independence, the idea that we should be able to stand on our own. So American childhood is often viewed as teaching children how to stand on their own and be perfectly independent without needing anyone else. So the song, I've got no strings to hold me down, right? Like that idea, it's very much about a child being able to step out on their own. And I feel like this song, if you don't put it in context whatsoever, the song is funny and it's upbeat and it's like, oh yeah, kids can be on their own. But like if you put it within the wider context of the movie, it's kind of a sad song. He can't actually do these things, even if he can physically walk around without strings. He needs that connection to other people. He needs the connection to Jiminy, to Geppetto, even the Blue Fairy in some ways, in order to grow and be better. And so this song, it's one of those songs that I feel like grows on you in a different way as you grow up, because like as a kid you're just like, this is fun and it's whatever, but when you actually start thinking about what it's saying about childhood and the fact that it's pretty much a lie all the way through, metaphorically speaking. Physically speaking, yes, he can run around without strings, but like metaphorically speaking, as a child he can't. And I just find that really fascinating.
Yeah. And then you get to the part where Ultron chimes in.
Right? Oh my gosh, I forgot this song is used in that movie, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Gosh, that blasted the internet. Like, what was it, 9 years ago?
Well, it's fascinating when Disney tries to use its properties in different places. I remember the first time I saw Wreck-It Ralph in theaters, they use the Darth Vader breathing sound at one point when I think it's Ralph is underwater or under fudge something anyway, and he's swimming and you can hear it's the Darth Vader breathing sound, and it's because they had just acquired Lucasfilm when they were making this movie, and so they're like, aha, we can use this now. Yep. And it's always so funny to see how Disney does that.
Now, as the show continues, there are puppets that represent Holland, France, and Russia, who emerge to dance alongside Pinocchio. Notably, 2 of these 3 groups predominantly involve women. And their lyrics are very cheeky come-ons to Pinocchio. And I really don't want to spend too much time talking about this particular movie, but the 2022 remake, I will appreciate that they removed these portions because of ethnic stereotypes. But also, they do present a very uncomfortable question, which is that this is really Pinocchio's, first impression of sexuality. Does that make sense? Like, I don't want to be weird about it, but like The fact that,
No.
aside from the Blue Fairy, like, these are the most mature female characters in the film. But they're not even real.
Yeah. And the Disney child must always be heterosexual and also must always be innocent. And I feel like this scene does that beautifully. So we have, these very adult looking marionette women coming on to Pinocchio, but he also has no idea what to do with it. He is just so confused all the way through because, as you say, it's his like first experience of sexuality. And like, it's very obvious that he has practiced the first part of that scene, the part where he starts singing and walks down the stairs. He's practiced. But I am unsure if they practiced the rest of the scene because he seems so confused when everything comes out. So this may be his actual first brush with these puppets, which just, further exaggerates his introduction to sexuality.
Yeah. And also because I think the bigger picture topic here is that Pinocchio is shown to be a sentient marionette who is typically, like, marionettes are typically made to perform in shows. But because he's real and can make decisions and act on certain things, it's like he's shown to not be made for this kind of life. Mm-hmm. Which I think is just a really interesting way of being like, you're made for so much more than this.
So true. Yeah.
We were rooting for you. We were all rooting for you.
And I think, just what you're saying, it makes me think about Jiminy's comments. And I've never really... I see what Jiminy's getting at in the scene, don't get me wrong, but he's just so judgmental in a very adult in an animated movie kind of way, that I have a hard time siding with him. And that's probably the kid in me still. But it does make me wonder if we're supposed to be siding with him, to be like, no, you could be more than this.
But I don't know, because he's not been, up to that point, he's not been shown to be a very reliable cricket.
This is true.
Yeah, because he's hot for wooden women. He is late in following Pinocchio to school. He is ineffective in telling him not to follow these foxes and cats anywhere. All they can do is just sit by the sidelines and judge.
But that's what a conscience is, right? A conscience isn't always effective. It's just like this little voice inside our heads that tell us maybe that's a bad idea. But it's not always great at like rhetorical arguments. I think it's fair that he's not as effectual as we would like him to be.
And plus he's bringing out those spectacles when the French girls come out. Yeah. Can't put that. I can't coincide his reactions to Pinocchio's in that moment. That's for sure.
Right. Very, very different.
Yeah. But here's where things get ugly. So, originally, there were to be Chinese and African puppets, but thankfully they got cut.
Oh, thank goodness.
But the context in which the latter would appear was described in a continuity outline thusly. Quote, "The final act is a jungle scene in which the music is treated in an unusual, modern manner, building up to a strong climax of dancing Ubangi puppets." Unquote. Now, the term was coined in reference to the Congolese women of the Sera tribe in the Central African Republic, who even today wear lip plates for various personal and spiritual purposes. But the term itself does not refer to any actual tribe. In fact, its reference to any sort of people has been traced back to its use by a press agent for the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus. Several Congolese women were involved in their grotesque and othering circus acts and sideshows up through 1940. So, unfortunately, this misnomer was one of the Disney story team's primary resources when depicting or even understanding African culture.
I mean, that feels kind of on brand, though, right?
Yeah.
Like, even the way that they would adapt fairy tales. I think it was Snow White that Walt based their version of Snow White not on the Grimms, but on a play of Snow White that he had seen.
Yes.
So we're getting several steps away, right? Research was not their forte in their adaptation, in their representation of different peoples. I'm very glad they did not include that, because that would have been awful and would have made this movie even more problematic.
Mm-hmm. Plus, also, it makes it seem like they wanted to have these caricatures performing in, like, a modern jazzy kind of thing with, like, eccentric dancing and stuff like that. And I just don't think that they had a firm grasp on the Black experience, particularly in America.
It does remind me of It's a Small World, which, of course, wasn't even developed until after this movie was already out. But the desire to show peoples from all over the world, it is very It's a Small World. And the figurines that we do get in the movie do resemble some of the It's a Small World figurines. So this global reach that Disney has been going for is something that you can see running throughout the entire company.
Yeah. It's just that when Mary Blair does it, I don't feel as icky.
Yes, but I think that's largely because her work is so stylized instead of trying to actually represent human bodies, and so we're more comfortable with it.
Yeah. Oh my god. Don't even get me started on The Lion King. Okay. All right. Pinocchio is shown to have independently moving joints while he's trying to do a Cossack-style dance. Just another way of having... There was one piece that I read, I think it was by James Bond in his book, Music in Disney's Animated Features, where he was talking about how, because the context of the scene is set on a theatrical performance, that forces the movie-going audience to observe and appreciate Pinocchio as an animated character. And I think that section is indicative of that. It's kind of a little meta.
That's what I was just thinking. It's like when you have a play within a play or something,
Yeah.
and it makes you remember that these are actors playing characters who are then playing other characters.
Characters that aren't even flesh and blood. Right,
exactly.
The inner machinations in my mind are an enigma. Cut to spilled carton of milk. Anyway. But then by the end of the song, Pinocchio is proven to be a super huge success. Like, those gold coins just keep being thrown his and Stromboli's way. And Jiminy's like, maybe I've been too strict. Maybe this kid knows what's up. And he walks away dejected.
It's such an interesting moment. I mean, you were talking about the failures of Jiminy a minute ago, but like the idea that they made money on it, so it's okay, is a really fascinating one for the conscience to think about in this moment. Just another failure of this poor little cricket.
Yeah.
Who did not ask to be a conscience for a live marionette puppet, to be fair.
No. And I love that that's been the main through line through my episodes on this movie so far. It's like everyone doesn't seem to like Jiminy very much.
Oh. I kind of feel bad for him because he did not ask for this situation and he's thrown into it, and he's not good at his job, as you've pointed out. But he's trying his best in his own way.
Yeah, and I wonder if most of it just comes from the fact that the only thing people really remember vividly about him is When You Wish Upon a Star. And because I really feel like Jiminy is going through an arc in this movie the same way Pinocchio is, but it's in a different situation where he is struggling to become more mature and take on responsibility. Because as we see in the beginning, he's like in a tattered outfit, equivalent to a hobo. But he's given the opportunity to look after Pinocchio, and he's awarded this nice suit and top hat and spats and everything. And he just has... I think he's meant to learn to appreciate more than frivolity and wealth. I mean, sure, he gets that gold badge at the end, but but he's supposed to have reformed just the way as Pinocchio is reborn, I guess.
So it's really interesting you talking about how he has this like his own little arc. In the 40s is when we start seeing Disney creating what would eventually become called the family film, which didn't exist before this point in time. Even the early Disney films, like I don't think you could call Snow White a family film. I think Pinocchio is one of our first truly Disney family films. But Noel Brown argues that one of the clearest identifiers of a family film versus a children's film versus a kidult film versus an adult film or a teen film is that a family film will have two audience identifiers that have their own plot lines and that they connect, but that they're separate so that the child and the adult and the audience can both connect to characters. So for the kid, we have Pinocchio, obviously, and then for the adult, instead of Geppetto, we have Jiminy Cricket, because that allows him to stay on screen more often than what Geppetto would be able to do. So I do think this is, I mean, in Collodi's book, Pinocchio kills Jiminy like almost immediately after meeting him, which is pretty intense. His ghost shows up occasionally when Pinocchio is making particularly bad decisions.
He's like, stop being an idiot.
Exactly. So instead of doing that, they changed it so that he becomes the adult identification figure for the movie, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. But I guess the other key takeaway from the performance is that because Pinocchio is a distinctly American character, it is awkward that it feels like everyone else, aside from Jiminy, is meant to be Italian or European-ish. But then when you put that next to his lifeless, old world European partners, and then you have Stromboli, who's this Jewish caricature, reaping the benefits of his American puppets fame.
There's so much wrong with that.
Yeah.
I mean, Walt is famously anti-Semitic. So it's unshocking when making this villain that is a direction that was chosen.
I mean, post World War II, I think he got better, but before then, yeah, he was just as ignorant as everyone else.
Right. Well, and
he was the Sherman Brothers.
You're talking about like the differences between Pinocchio and the other marionettes, visually speaking. And I mean, even all of the other marionettes, they're very fluid, they're very curvy, especially the women. But even the Russian dancers are, you know, more lifelike than what Pinocchio is with his like, I don't know, 2x2 arms that are very square and not rounded off or anything like that. And he's very awkward. So I do think it's interesting that the marionettes are in some ways a lot more fluid and graceful than Pinocchio, who's very awkward and angular and all of this stuff. And I do think that makes an even larger distinction between Pinocchio and everyone else.
Yeah, it's like they definitely went to Juilliard.
Juilliard for marionettes.
But yeah, that was pretty much everything I had about the scene, and then I can get us into a little history lesson.
feel like there was one other thing I wanted to say about the marionettes. Oh, yeah. So the other thing about the scene, you know, I said earlier that the song is trying to emphasize Pinocchio's independence. What's interesting about the adaptation of the scene from the novel is that in Claudi's novel, Pinocchio goes to the show. He's not performing in it. He just goes.
He wasn't kidnapped either.
No, he wasn't kidnapped. You're right. He doesn't meet the tricksters until after the performance, actually. But he goes to the show and he's sitting in the back, and the marionettes like zero in on him and are like, our friend. And so like they become right. They become cognizant, I guess, at this point in time, and they call him up on stage and he goes, and they have like a family reunion kind of thing. And
aren't they like a Commedia dell'arte kind of puppets?
They are, yes, for sure. And so instead of performing in the show, like Pinocchio runs up to the front and he actually interrupts the show. And so everybody's mad at him because they're like, get on with the play, get on with the play. And they're just like having this, you know, like lovely, you're a marionette, I'm a marionette too. Yay. And like everybody's having a great time. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting that we go from this scene that is all about connection, and finding, you know, like a found family kind of situation, to the scene where Pinocchio is so incredibly cut. You know, it's like, it's clear that he's not like the audience. It's clear he's not like Stromboli. It's clear that he's not like the marionettes on stage, who are never, you know, never have a consciousness.
He's not like other puppets.
He's not like other puppets. He's been cut off from Geppetto and from Jiminy. So he's just like completely and totally alone. In so many ways. So I find it very fascinating that we went from connection to loneliness, and the adaptation of the scene.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've read the book, and now that you brought that up, that makes this even worse.
I know, it's so sad. And like,
just
the fire eater,
give the boy a bone.
Right. Well, and the fire eater gets mad at Pinocchio for interrupting the show. And so after the show, he wants to use Pinocchio for firewood. And Pinocchio lays out his whole like sad life story. And he's like, you're making me have emotions. Stop that. And so
I got my own father arrested. Please spare me.
Right. Exactly. So instead of throwing him in the fire, he lets Pinocchio go and gives him 5 gold pieces to leave with. And like, that is so incredibly different from Stromboli. It's just, it's wild.
It's a complete 180. Oh gosh. Okay, and this is part 2 of uncomfortable subjects we're getting into right now, but this has to do with religion. So it turns out from my research that the notion of a child being taken away from his family to join a theatrical troupe is actually not that unrealistic. So, in late 15th, early 16th century England, it was eerily common for young boys to be abducted and taken by men like James Robinson, Nathaniel Giles, and Henry Evans to perform for the Blackfriars Company. As in one case, 13-year-old Thomas Clifton was walking off to Christ Church at Oxford to study grammar. But he was snatched up by Robinson and Evans and forced to memorize a script under the threat of being whipped. Similarly captured boys included John Chappell, John Motteram, Nathan Field, Alvery Trussell, Philip Pikeman, Thomas Grimes, and Solomon Pavey. And these boys were all snatched from local like cathedral choirs and whatnot, so they were all part of the Catholic Church.
Okay, so late 15th, early 16th century, most people are the Catholic Church. Like we have it in the UK, the split with the church doesn't happen until the 16th century.
Yeah. But we're not even done yet.
Oh, good Lord.
Luckily, in Clifton's case, it turns out he was both a bad singer and the son of a nobleman. Henry Clifton, the boy's father, was affluent and popular enough to sue the company and won his son back, thankfully. Giles, who was the master of, I believe it was the Children of the Chapel, that was their performing troupe. He renewed his commission in 1626 and was allowed, with the stipulation that no snatched boy be made a comedian or actor, quote, as it is not fit or decent that such as should sing the praises of God Almighty should be trained or employed in such lascivious and profane exercises, unquote.
Use puppets instead.
Yes. Well, it's just weird because it's like, you can still kidnap these children.
What's killing me is that this poor lord is like, there's my child, and he had to sue to get his child back. He couldn't just be like, that's my kid.
Yes.
Like, can I have him back?
Yes.
Jeez.
And I feel like a similar thing would happen in Pinocchio if the opportunity came up. And then Stromboli would be like, no way, I'm taking this kid.
Well, and part of that is, how is Geppetto going to prove that Pinocchio belongs to him, with him, whatever?
Yeah. There's no biological relation, no.
Right. And there's like no papers. He's been around for like a day, so.
Oh my God. Well, it was nice knowing you, kid. But I should have clarified that these kids were being forced to perform in plays based on works that satirized anything from English politics to chivalric romances to religion, things like that. But it was still weird considering their patronage was largely adult men.
Well, this is also the same time period where women couldn't perform on stage.
Yes. Yes.
So boys would play female parts. I mean, thinking of Romeo and Juliet, which is, almost 100 years later, but still. Juliet would have been performed by a boy or a young man. Yeah. So they were stealing them early.
Yeah. And I'm sure the kisses back then were chaste. The fact that Queen Elizabeth I actually gave Giles the warrant to take said children, like, just so she could have access to the finest musicians in the country.
That feels on brand.
Yeah. Oh my God, the nobles, we love them. But to make the connections even more coincidental, this whole puppet act in the Disney film could have depicted a satire of a morality play. To quote an early outline, quote, Pinocchio visions himself ascending to puppet heaven, which is populated with puppet angels on strings, including Gabriel and St. Peter, who tells him he isn't good enough to enter heaven. So he descends to the nether regions and finds himself in the puppet hell, where puppet devils burn marionette sinners and chop them up for firewood. Satan tells him that he hasn't been bad enough and sends him back to Earth. Unquote.
I wish they had kept that.
Oh my God.
It's amazing. I mean, I feel like the hell part would have been, considering what they do with Pleasure Island, I'm sure the hell part would have been terrifying. But it would have been great.
Well, then I feel like it would be a bit too meta. It's like you have Pinocchio in this morality play, and then you have him performing a morality play, and then I feel like that would make him come off as, like, dumb. Like, how are you not getting this?
But I mean, God bless him. Pinocchio is dumb. Like, he's a bit of a blockhead, and pun very much intended. But he does not make good decisions, but also he doesn't know things. He's only been alive for like a day and a half.
Yeah. So, and actually that whole section there, initially it was pitched as like a dream that Pinocchio was having. But then as development continued, I believe it was Dick Humor who was like, oh, you could use your heaven and hell stuff in this scene. And then they eventually cut it. Yeah.
It would have been absolutely terrifying as a dream sequence.
Yes. We just need to scare this child into doing the right thing. That is what Pinocchio is.
I mean, that's what children's literature was for so long.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at the Grimm's fairy tales, so much of that is you go off the path, you get eaten by wolves. Like
Your eyes get pecked out.
Right. Everything about that was like, if you do this one bad thing, you die. So I mean, it feels like it fits into the wider children's literature situation, at least.
Yeah. Maybe that's why Alice in Wonderland has remained my favorite. Because it doesn't get into that stuff.
True.
God bless Lewis Carroll. Anyway. But yeah, that, in a roundabout sort of way, is the Marionette show sequence, unless you had anything else to add.
I mean, we could talk about child stars moving forward.
Sure.
So as I was rewatching the scene, and especially with the scene, and it's like after they finish the performance, and Pinocchio and Stromboli are like in Stromboli's office, and he's counting up all of his money, and very kind of a, you know, Ebenezer Scrooge kind of situation. Stromboli says something about like, I'm gonna, you know, make sure your face is everywhere. Everyone,
she'll be on everybody's tongue.
Yes, exactly.
Will she?
And it made me think of child stars. And you know, today when we think child stars that Disney has had a hand in kind of ruining, feels like a hard word, but making their life more difficult. Most people probably think of like Lindsay Lohan, who obviously had a bad transition into adulthood. Seems to be getting, you know, her life back together now, which is wonderful. But probably the first child star that Disney kind of ate up and spat back out was Bobby Driscoll, who was perhaps most famous for voicing Peter Pan, and playing Jim Hawkins in the live action Treasure Island that Disney did. So Bobby Driscoll started as a child actor in the 40s, right around the same time that we have Pinocchio coming out. And he was kind of the darling of Disney for a hot second. And then he started to grow up, and Disney's like, we don't need you anymore. You're no longer a cute kid. We're done.
Didn't he develop really bad acne?
He did. And it was very clear that he wasn't a child anymore. And I mean, I feel like it's always unfair to say that someone caused someone else to make bad decisions. But from there, Driscoll got into drugs and then eventually died from drug-related problems, health problems. And this is like a pretty tragic story, right? Like once he wasn't a kid and wasn't cute anymore, he didn't matter anymore. And Disney's recent Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers actually kind of echoes this history in a really awful way. Like, so spoiler alert, for those of you who don't know, the villain in Chip 'n Dale is Sweet Pete, who is a grown-up Peter Pan, because in this world, animated people play animated characters anyway. So,
but they age?
Right. Just Peter. Nobody else seems to be aging. Like Chip 'n Dale seems the same age. I don't know. Anyway, they grew up, I guess.
God, it would have been so fun to watch him in, what was the rip-off movie called? Little Flying Boy or something?
Yes. So when Peter Pan got too old and started getting acne, it's like the studios wouldn't hire him anymore. And that was the beginning of his like villain origin story. So it just seems very macabre of Disney to be like, here is this actual human that we kind of messed up their lives, and we're going to make fun of it in this movie. Like, it was a choice. It was a very strange choice on Disney's part.
I really want to look up the screenwriter for that movie. I want to see what they know.
It's like, did you know about the Bobby Driscoll story? Because like, if you didn't, this is oddly on point, and if you did, kind of cruel. Anyway, I bring up all of this to say that like, it's really interesting to see Disney having the concept of a child star so central to this movie, when Disney and other studios, right, like Judy Garland, Shirley Temple, as you've already said in this podcast, like they had hard times too with other studios. But it's really interesting to see Disney portraying child stardom as like kind of tragic, right? Like he's locked into the cage at the end. He's really sad. He's crying. He just wants his dad. He's being taken advantage of by Stromboli. Like we're supposed to see this as a bad situation, and yet Disney as a company turns around and does the exact same thing to real children. And I find that kind of disheartening, I guess. It's like, you know it's a problem. Why are you doing it?
Yeah. The only defense I can give is that at the time, that probably would have been a primary way of letting the general public know that child actors at the time didn't have it so easy. But I don't think they were thinking that hard about it.
No, but it is, again, like I said, Pinocchio in Colladi's book is not a performer, so it is something that Disney like consciously added in. So it is interesting to see how they've made childhood into a spectacle and are very clearly critiquing how child stars are being treated, even when they're very famous for creating child stars, or would become very famous for creating child stars.
Yeah. Oh boy. How do I recover from that?
Oh, sorry.
Well, I guess the final thing, this is kind of minor, but I think we should end on a neat little fun fact instead of a bummer. So originally this puppet show was supposed to be held inside like a physical theater that they had like designed concepts for and everything. But in the final film, we see that this is just like a set of wagons that Stromboli pedals around from village to village. But you can actually see the physical representation of the theater if you go to Disneyland, because the Pinocchio's Daring Journey attraction is housed inside of the space that's like built in front of.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So it's like a conceptual piece actually made it three-dimensional.
Disney was really good about doing that, especially, I mean, always, but especially if you look at the early history of Disneyland and then Walt Disney World, you see the way that they were bringing their set artists from the animation side and having them design stuff for the parks. So you do get to see that, you know, these really interesting animated settings become 3D, which is fun.
Yeah. And I pray for the day that I can actually go there because I live in the Midwest, and I don't drive yet, so it's hard to just go over there and be like, oh, look at all this neat stuff.
Look at this stuff. Isn't it neat?
Yeah. Yes, you know. But I guess that brings me to our final question. How do you think the Marionette show sequence in Pinocchio influences the way the Walt Disney Studios produces films to this day?
That's an interesting question. I mean, sorry, when you think of how is it influencing animation, my first thought is Shrek with the Duloc puppets.
Oh my God.
Which is very clearly, you know, making fun of Pinocchio, which is fantastic. But I mean, I keep using the word spectacle, but that's what it is. And I think we see that sense of performance in a lot of Disney animation. That's obviously been important to Disney at so many levels. We, you know, have these great videos of an actress performing the dance sequences for Sleeping Beauty as they like
Helene
withdraw
Stanley,
off of
yes.
that. Yeah, right. So the idea of performance has always been important to Disney and continues to be so. But I think sequences like this just really drive home how important that is, and and Disney's ability to capture different kinds of movement. So the different kinds of puppets that we see in the scene and how they're able to do all that is something that Disney is fantastically good at and continues to be so. Mm-hmm.
I'd say it's influential for mostly the wrong reasons. Because of course, you know, like whenever anytime that Disney promotes this film, they usually pull up images from this scene. But I wouldn't exactly call it one of the brighter spots story-wise in the film. Like, I think particularly they did a television special in the 50s. It was like a Christmas special, and they were showing all of these clips from like various Disney animated films, and they highlighted this sequence in Pinocchio, and I was like, this doesn't really put me in the holiday spirit, because I'm thinking about this child being exploited.
Right. But I feel like it's it's like what I was saying earlier about it's taken out of context so often and made into this like happy-go-lucky thing. I think it reminds me of how like Zippity Doo Dah has been taken out of Song of the South, and that's like the only thing that gets to survive. It's like Disney just pretends it didn't come out of that movie,
and even then it shouldn't. So
right, but early Disney, I feel like there are things that get lifted a lot and just taken out. Like, we're just going to pay attention to this. Forget the rest of that.
Yeah. But I'd say that, like, there's something that other sequences in the movie do better that I think they've learned from, because this sequence doesn't really give it. And that is that they know how to balance the emotional stakes within the story with what the character is going through, what the audience should be feeling, how thematically resonant these moments can be, because I'm just watching a performance.
I mean, it kind of reminds me of Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is quite easily one of my favorite Disney movies. I love that movie. Mm-hmm. But that movie is so emotional and it's paced really well in a lot of ways. But then we get scenes like Guy Like You, where the gargoyles are singing, which is just like a weird like throw in. And I do think, scenes like that kind of expose the way that Disney is basically writing the rule book on what a family film is supposed to be and how it's supposed to hit different beats in certain ways.
Yes.
And they don't always get it right, and they have to experiment and figure out better. So we get moments like No Strings and Guy Like You, where it's like, you did not hit that right. But they learn and they get better.
Yeah. But I will give them a pass. It's like, this is supposed to show, at least from Pinocchio's perspective, it's supposed to show the good side of the theater before the dark side rears its ugly head. Mm-hmm. I just don't think that it's any good.
Just didn't do a good job.
They didn't do a good job, not for me. But I give them a gold star. Unlike those gargoyles. God, that was so inappropriate.
But the thing is, like, when I was a kid, No Strings and Guy Like You were my favorite parts some of my favorite parts of the movies, right? Because they were fun and they were upbeat, and like those movies are not fun and upbeat.
But when you put it, it's like No Strings comes after a very like peppy villain song, and then Guy Like You comes after Hellfire. And it's like, it's not Hellfire quite the same thing.
Oh, I know, right? That is such a swing in emotional resonance.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
And it comes right before Esmeralda brings in Phoebus, like, dying. And it's like...
And then she starts making out with him in front of Quasimodo.
It's like, that whole song was not useful.
No! Oh, my God. All right. Well, I guess that concludes this chapter on Disney Reel to Reel. Also, screw actors. Not really, I swear. But do you have any resources that you'd like to share with my listeners?
I am the editor of International Journal of Disney Studies, which is the first academic journal in the world to focus on Disney and all of its intellectual property. So if you have any Disney thoughts, come check us out or submit something. I am also head of operations for Disney Culture and Society Research Network, which is the first academic network for really anyone who's interested in thinking seriously about Disney. And I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I think they're both great resources if you're interested in Disney and learning more about it. So come check us out.
Yes, yes. A lot of my previous guests have also been involved with the DisNet community as well, in case anyone is interested in looking and reaching out, including Abigail Fine and Marley Healy and B. Eldridge. So, lovely, lovely scholarship.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, but you can also find our show at Dis Reel to Reel Podcast on Instagram. Any messages via email can be sent to disneyreeltoreel@gmail.com. And by this point in the year of our Lord 2024, I'm just going to abandon our Tumblr page because nothing has happened.
Oh, Tumblr.
I wanted to make that a thing so bad, but we just couldn't keep up the momentum.
Poor Tumblr couldn't keep up with the momentum. It's just having a hard time.
Poor guys. All right. Well, until next time, have a magical day, everybody.
I got no strings to hold me down, to make me fret or make me frown. I had strings, but now I'm free. There are no strings on me. Heigh-ho, the Mario, that's the only way to be. I want the world to know nothing ever bothers me. I got no strings, so I have fun. I'm not tied up to anyone. They get strings, but you can see there are no strings on me.
Huh. Well, they like him. He's a success. Maybe I was wrong. Well, I guess he won't need me anymore. What does an actor want with a conscience anyway? Goodbye, Pinocchio. Goodbye. Goodbye.